The next cyber threat to talk about, you knew it was coming, ransomware. We can't go a day or a week without hearing about a new ransomware attack. My team looks at these all the time, and it's incredibly tragic. You hear about hospitals or schools getting ransomed. Absolutely awful. But if you take a step back and kind of look at ransomware in a neutral academic way, it's a little bit fascinating to think about how we've had malware for a long time, worms have been around, etc. But someone thought, a human thought, well, cool, I could just put code and steal something or, wreck your machine. But what if we held all of your data for ransom? A human had that thought. And after ransomware started, you see this huge adoption taking off because it works. It's so tough if you've been hit by ransomware. Like, my sympathies, because that is a rough day and trying to decide, do I pay the ransom or not? And we'll talk about how that can be even more complicated. But ultimately, ransomware relies on a system of trust. Adversaries do this because it works. And imagine if we all just said, we're not going to pay you. Nope. We all agreed. Everyone in the entire world agreed we're not going to pay the ransom. Adversaries would likely give it up, which is why you might hear some law enforcement advising you don't pay the ransom. But that's tough. All your data is encrypted. If you pay, you'll get it back. It's a tough decision. And so ransomware, I think, is one of the most interesting examples of the human threat. A recent ransomware family and campaign that my team has seen, folks at Symantec put out an awesome blog that I've used to inspire this slide. This family is called Wasted Locker, and the group behind this is known as Evil Corp. Yeah, really, if you're an adversary, don't call it Evil Corp. Come on. Yeah, so two Russian adversaries were actually indicted a few months ago for Evil Corp. They've been behind a bunch of different attacks, and the latest one is Wasted Locker ransomware. And so you think ransomware, yeah, you come in and you just ransom the files. But the interesting thing about Wasted Locker was they kind of had some other steps along the way that are outlined in the slides. So the adversaries would start out and their victims would be redirected from some legit site that they'd compromised. So you get redirected, and then they would deliver malware called SockGhoulish. Kind of a fun name, SockGhoulish, and this is malware that my team has seen quite a bit used as kind of an initial access vector. Download a malicious zip file. From there, some PowerShell execution, some code to download another tool called Cobalt Strike, really common red teaming tool that adversaries like as well. And after the adversaries moved laterally, kind of learned about the environment, used Cobalt Strike, then they would drop the Wasted Locker ransomware. That'd be the last step. So it's kind of interesting because you often might have heard this idea that, well, adversaries have the advantage. They only have to be right once, but defenders have to be right every time. Well, check this out. You have all of these different steps before your files are actually ransomed to try to catch these actors. And I had a note, yes, Evil Corp, that reference is from Mr. Robot. So kind of an anonymous attendee chiming in with that. So think about the fact, and some organizations, I think, caught this early. We have an opportunity to try to catch these adversaries before they get to the ransomware phase. So think of this as an opportunity rather than a challenge. You have all of these chances to identify these adversaries and kick them out before you get ransomed. So this is sort of a classic ransomware example, one that my team has recently been seen a lot around the entire community. I talked about how ransomware is a very human type of malware. And you might have noticed or read about the fact that ransomware operators actually have support. This is a screenshot from a blog from one company, and it's on the malware known as Ragnar or Ragnar Locker. And I talked about how adversaries have the incentive to, have people pay ransoms and to keep this thing going. Right? If people pay ransoms, the adversaries get money, then next time, people know if I pay the ransom, my files are going to get decrypted and I can go on. And so adversaries actually have an incentive to help their victims be able to pay the ransom. So you'll often see in ransomware, you get some kind of, note dropped to the desktop, something like that, a note with a ransom demand saying, pay us Bitcoins, go to this link, email us here. And Ragnar Locker operators actually have a support chat. And so we see here a screenshot of, hello, can I help you? And our victim asking, what do we have to do to get our data back? We want my data, please give it back to me. And they say, all right, you need to pay me in Bitcoins, cryptocurrency. And just to show that, we're for real, we'll decrypt 2 files for free. I always think of that like an infomercial, right? Like 2 files free decryption. So it's fascinating, this human aspect of ransomware, that adversaries actually will support victims because they want their money. If I don't know how to get Bitcoins, they will help me. So that's pretty common, having some kind of support for ransomware operators. But the operators of Ragnar Locker leveled up a little bit in their human ingenuity. This is absolutely fascinating. The adversaries offered what I would say consulting. After the victim paid the ransom, they gave them security recommendations on how to avoid ransomware in the future. Seriously, it was in Reuters. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. It's kind of amazing. Maybe we've often seen this with adversaries. They don't want other people to compromise their victims. So you should turn off local passwords. You should get an endpoint detection response appliance. Don't count just on antivirus. It's absolutely fascinating, but adversaries gave their victims security recommendations. Another example of how the threat is human, but even maybe adversaries have a heart of gold and they want to help their victims after they've paid. So something to think about. Maybe if you pay a ransom, you'll get free security advice, but that's not a good way to go about it. You can get consulting in other ways, of course. That's ransomware, something we've seen quite a bit. And what we've also seen is that some operators are doing more than just ransoming. So you might be familiar with the Maze ransomware, and this just came out, I believe, yesterday, that Maze operators, what they do is they say, you have to pay our ransom. And if you don't pay us a ransom, we're going to leak your files. And so that is so tough. You have to calculate the risk of not just not paying the ransom because you might lose your data, but now that could be leaked. And on the screen is a supposed leak of files from LG. It just came out yesterday. And this just throws a wrench into this entire ransomware thing. And again, human ingenuity at work here. The fact that, well, losing my data, that's bad enough. But what's worse than that? Leaking sensitive data. And so these Maze operators have changed this up even more and added to this very, very difficult calculus that we already have to make in terms of ransomware. I have an interesting question come in terms of Garmin paying for ransomware. What's the likelihood? You might have heard Garmin was one of the groups impacted, one of the companies impacted by ransomware recently. What's the likelihood that they might get hit again or not by the same group? It's a really tough question. And, in cyber threat intelligence, we have to make assessments. Generally, and this is based on anecdotal experience, I've found that a lot of operators don't go back to compromise the same victim. That said, if I were an adversary, if I were a ransomware operator and I knew Garmin paid a ransom that was public, I might say, excellent, I know that they will pay a ransom, so I should go after them. So I don't think we can know for sure. Anecdotally, I haven't seen much evidence of the same group going after victims again. That's not to say that it might not happen. So good to always be thinking like an adversary.